Good evening. When we hear the word slavery, the immediate mental association is with the slavery that officially ended in America with the emancipation concurrent and following the American Civil War that ended in 1865. And though slavery was common in antiquity, even in the Old Testament, it is assumed that when the Roman Empire officially ended in 476 AD, the infrastructure, as we would say today, collapsed. But we know that slavery continued, even if only in extremely scant records. For example, when the Bishop of Le Mans transferred the large estate to the Abbey of St. Vincent in 572 AD, 10 slaves went with it. And in the 7th century, the wealthy Saint Eloi bought British and Saxon slaves in batches of 50 to 100 so that he could set them all free. But we know more about slavery for the periods beginning soon after the year 1000 and throughout the rest of the Middle Ages, until slavery gradually died in Europe during the 1500 and 1600 and was formally banned in England worldwide in 1838. To refresh the etymology, the word slave derives from the medieval Latin sclavus, that in turn derives from the root Slav, simply because many early wars of the Middle Ages were fought in the Balkans, in what today is Crimea, and in Eastern Europe in general. Regions inhabited by many different people who, for simplicity, were called slaves and spoke Slavic languages. Or perhaps they spoke Slavic languages and were therefore called slaves. A characterization still extant today when we refer to the Slavic people. Slaves made an excellent subject for plastic sculptural representation, as in these examples by Michelangelo, the bearded slave and the dying slave. The statues were supposed to decorate the tomb of the warrior Pope Julius II in the year 1500. Around 1200 AD, the term slave or sclavus acquires in Europe what we call a juridical category, though identifying people of the most different origins. Yet, at the time, the term referred principally to Moors and Muslims. We should remember that Muslim expansion in Europe from the 7th to the 8th century and beyond. And to refresh historical information, the Muslim advance in Europe was first checked in the Battle of Poitiers in 7032 AD by the French king Charles Martel. He is generally considered the founder of the European Middle Ages. Moving forward, we tend to think of the Renaissance, the 1500, as the beginning of what we call the modern age. But in reality, the first Renaissance, according to the historical, at least to a historical school of thought, occurred after the year 1000 with the introduction of technological innovations, of organized trade, of usury and capitalism. One of the centers of economic expansion and trade was the Republic of Genoa in Italy. And Genoa, as you can see on the map, had acquired a significant, we could say, colonial and commercial presence all along the Mediterranean, the Black Sea, and notably in Crimea. In the map, the dark areas were actual colonies, the areas marked with diamonds were franchised trading centers. Other notable areas specifically mentioned in the slave trade were the region that goes under the name of Circassia, today part of Russia, as you can see on the map, and as well as the region of Abkhazia, which includes part of South Ossetia. They are somewhat obscure regions of the Caucasus, recently involved in wars of dubious honesty, intended to expand the empire of NATO, as you know. Today in Genoa, the name of her ancient medieval colonies on the shores of the Black Sea are immortalized in various street names. For example, Via Trebisonda, today the city is called Trabzon in Turkey, Via Caffa, which is and was an Italian rendering of Kaffa on the Crimean shore. It was a Tartar town, and the Tartar prince leased the city to the Genoese. The Tartars thought that the mercantile and sea traffic stimulated by the Genoese would benefit the empire, the Tartar Empire, that is. Sometimes different names given to the same place in different times bear witness to the historical vicissitudes of the cities or lands involved. For example, Kaffa was originally a Greek city named Theodosia, and with the advent of the Tartars it became Kaffa, or Kaffa as the Genoese said. In modern Crimea it is called Theodosia in the Russian rendering of the original Greek name. Another important colony was Trebizonda, today called Trabzon, on the northern coast of Turkey. And here is how it looked in a print of 1718. As an aside, there is or was an old expression in Italian to lose Trebizonda, meaning to lose one's bearing, literally and figuratively. The expression seems meaningless, but it isn't. In antiquity, Trebizonda, or Trabzon today, was a visual reference for ships sailing in the Black Sea. And losing the visual reference of Trebizonda or Trebzon meant often a shipwreck on the Turkish Black Sea coast. To return to slavery, thanks to these commercial outposts at several ports in the Mediterranean, Genoa became the hub, we could say, the hub of the slave trade. Once the slave reached Genoa, they were sold to buyers or resold to merchants from other places, especially Catalonia and the Balearic Islands. In the meantime, other cities in Italy began to allow the importation of slaves. This was accompanied and in some ways connected to the lack of manpower following the notorious plague epidemics of the Middle Ages. One of the most famous epidemics and deadly was that of 1348. And in 1364, Florence gave the green light to slave importation conducted by the wealthier families of the city. The slave trade was carried out both by licensed merchants, if we can call them this way, and by pirates. For example, the citizens of Dubrovnik or Ragusa, now in Croatia, started capturing ships carrying migrants from Albania to Venice. Similar raids also occurred along the Iberian Peninsula. Sometimes, however, it could happen that slaves employed as rowers on a ship would rebel, take hold of the ship, and turn the original passengers and crew into slaves themselves, whom they would later sell. Sometimes the line between slave trade and kidnapping was, as you can imagine, blurry. There is an archive reference, for example, to a case in 1492 where a free girl was invited on a ship in Naples, where she was captured and transported to Genoa, where she was sold as a slave. Her parents, however, immediately began a legal proceeding where they were successful, because a principle was applied whereby Christians could not be forced to become slaves. Throughout the 15th century, slavery was particularly intense. The Republic of Genoa, Venice and Genoa, both with colonies and commercial centers in the eastern Mediterranean and in the Black Sea, would trade in slaves and send them everywhere in Europe. But throughout the century there were significant transformations, namely the substitution of Muslims and Moors from the Iberian Peninsula to the traditional slaves of Slavic origin. For in 1492, the fall of Granada, the last European outpost of the Islamic kingdoms, made available a large number of Muslim slaves accompanied by North Africans from Algeria, Tunisia, and Morocco. Morocco, indeed, had been recently occupied by Portugal. Another way to acquire slaves was barter. Merchants would go into Central Africa, where they would exchange cloth, silk, and horses for slaves. They would bring the slaves to the coast and embark them on Genoese and Venetian ships for eventual sale on the European markets. Now the Portuguese joined the fray, so to speak, and the port of Cadix in Spain became a kind of slave transfer center. And especially in Portugal, the presence of black slaves was so heavy in Lisbon that we find in the chronicle of a traveler, "I thought I had landed into a city of devils." Of course, the association of the color black with darkness and consequently with fear goes way back before the 15th century. There were specialized slave merchants. For example, the Florentine merchants Bartolomeo Marchionni, with an office in Portugal, specialized in procuring slaves by order and specifications for prosperous Florentine families. In the 1300s, the Genoese sailor Lancelotto Malacello discovered the Canary Islands on behalf of the Kingdom of Portugal. Then, in the latter half of the 1400s, in the course of a war, Spain got definite rule over the Canary Islands, and the Pope at the time, who was Eugene IV, issued a bull called Sicut Dedum in 1435, which literally means "as recently." And this bull says, "And nevertheless, we order and recommend to each and all of the Christians faithful of both sexes, within 15 days from the day of appearance of this document, to be published in a place where they live, to return to freedom each and all of both sexes who first inhabited these islands, called Canaries, that is, those who were imprisoned after their capture and have been submitted to the bondage. We order them to make them free totally and forever, and to let them go without any payment or acceptance of money. Otherwise, after 15 days after they have elapsed, I order that they, the slaveholders, be immediately excommunicated, from which excommunication they can only be freed, but not before having returned to freedom the people captured and having returned the goods that belonged to them, unless they were at the point of death." Regrettably, the bull did not have much effect, so much so that successive popes Pius II and Sixtus IV reiterated the illicitness of the slavery at large. Nevertheless, the Canary Island slaves, especially female slaves, were particularly valued because, as we read in the archives, they were reputed of good sense and diligent in their assigned work. By now, the end of the 1400s, Catalonia and Majorca were the most assiduous buyers of slaves. If the records are correct, there were 3,000 slaves in Majorca and 20,000 in Catalonia. Genoa still remained a source of slaves for the states of Northern Europe, but traders from what today is the French Riviera bought them and resold them to the Kingdom of Savoy. In any event, in Italy as a whole, the quantity of slaves was small with respect, for example, to the Iberian Peninsula, and various factors determined the cost of a slave. Age, to begin. The most requested were around 20 years old. Then there was physical health, and whether or not they belonged to populations traditionally Christian. In fact, to a Christian slave was recognized juridical state, whereby he or she could be set free. This especially applied, for example, to Greeks, Hungarians, Albanians, and individuals from the Balkans. Therefore, their value or cost was less than for non-Christian slaves. If a female slave happened to be pregnant, it was a feature rather than a liability. Why? Because the mother could be rented out in the function of a nursing nanny, which was a position in great demand. Furthermore, of course, the newborn was automatically a new slave acquisition. There was also in place an insurance policy against the risks of the delivery by the slave via an insurance system already well functioning at the time. And in 1433, in Barcelona, there was established the right of the buyer to lodge a complaint within 1 year for illnesses that the slave may have acquired before being sold to the buyer. Today, the policy has certain ring reminding of insurance outfits that do not provide medical insurance for pre-existing conditions. In general, women were more expensive than men, especially women below 25 years of age. A slave with white skin was valued more than a slave with yellowish, olive, or dark skin. And influencing the value was also the assessed behavior of the slave and whether he or she came on the market, so to speak, via the accepted trade venues or through piracy, through pirates. The Latin term was capti de bona guerra, captured via a good war, and we will not inquire what constitutes a good war, nor why a slave captured by pirates, a contraband slave we would say, should cost less than an internationally sanctioned, as we would say today, an internationally sanctioned slave. The cost of a slave on the Genoese market in the first half of the 1400s ranged between 75 and 150 liras, corresponding to the median salary of an employed worker with some skills, annual salary, or to the 2-year salary of a sailor, a salary of around 58 liras. However, if compared to the cost of wheat in the middle of the 14th century, the value of a slave costing 150 liras was more than the value of 2 tons of wheat. The slave price increased even more after the middle of the 15th century because the Turks conquered Constantinople in 1453, thus ending the 1,000-year-old Byzantine Empire, also referred to as the Eastern Roman Empire. In turn, passage through the Dardanelles from Kaffa became more difficult, and the supply of slaves itself ran out from the northern shores of the Crimea, from the shores of Crimea. You may rightfully ask, how do we know of these costs and numbers? We know it from the import duties recorded in the archives of the Republic of Genoa, which are available for examination. So, for example, in 1428 there were 319 records of slaves purchased, but only 28 in 1472 due to the fall of Constantinople. And how were these European slaves employed? Women mostly, but also men were principally employed in domestic work. Men were also employed on ships as deckhands or rowers. This gave them the opportunity to escape once they reached other ports. Others were employed in agriculture, construction, and even in ceramic laboratories and painting studios. Although obvious, we should keep in mind that with no photography, painting studios were the only alternative. And sometimes, if the slave was talented, the painter would make the slave the heir of his activities, and this is recorded in various cases, both in Genoa and in Venice. Which means that sometimes imported slaves brought their own influence, as in Catalonia and in Marseille in France, where the influx and the influence of Oriental style in the second half of the 1300 is noticeable in the artwork of the time. But at times, the importation of slave manpower in art studios caused a negative reaction in those studios that could not afford slaves and were forced to face what they rated as unfair competition. Another typical occupation for slaves was the dyeing of cloth, the weaving of cloth, and the harvesting of corals. In the case of wealthy families, slaves would enhance the image of the household, and would be displayed as symbols of wealth. For example, the ceremony in Venice, painted by Gentile Bellini in the year 1500, has to do with the renewal of the recovery indeed in the canal of a relic of St. Lawrence. As you can see at the bottom right of the picture, a woman prompts her slave to dive into the canal to recover that relic. For what today we would call the middle class, a slave was an investment that had to be profitable. In the 1400s, in Catalonia and in Majorca, it became popular, the habit of buying children to be used as apprentice producers. And of course, in a non-automated and labor-intensive operation, free labor meant being able to sell at lower prices. And in 1467, in Barcelona, the public authorities were forced to put a limit to this, to avoid, for one, an excessive reduction of prices of the manufactured good, as well as avoiding that the apprentices became masters of a specific operation. At the time, the equivalent of our current labor laws were the guilds and their associated corporate statutes. They did not forbid slaves from being employed except when it was deemed important to safeguard the secrets of the trade. For example, in Genoa, the statutes of the apothecaries, the pharmacists, would forbid the teaching of the trade to Turks and Tartars for fear that they would learn how to prepare poisons to be administered to their masters. In Venice, instead, in 1455, the statute of jewelers and goldsmiths forbade to sell to any foreigner a slave who had been trained in the operation. Whereas the corporation of velvet makers prescribed that if a slave had learned the art of the trade of weaving and cloth making, he could not be sold without the approval of the corporate consuls and only to someone residing in Venice. As I said, following the deadly plague of 1348 in Europe, the need for manpower had created a condition where slaves were a rare and much sought-after commodity. Their prices had skyrocketed, and their trade, organized on a large scale in a ways of dubious legitimacy, became a means of getting rich quickly. One way was to loan out the slaves to people who needed them and who were prepared to pay a substantial sum for the loan. The cost of loaning a wet nurse, for example, could reach up to 10% of the original cost of the slave. We can get an idea of the brisk business in the loaning of slaves from the extant archives of Genoa. Regrettably, but it is still better than nothing, we can only know names, dates of transactions, and place of origin, and the rest is left to the imagination. For example, in 1450, Bernardo Dalla loans to Francesco Giustiniani the 22-year-old Circassian girl called Agnese for 2 years. And in 1456, the Catalan Egidio Royce rents the 21-year-old Circassian girl by the name of Lucia for 3 years from Antonio Uso di Mare, and so on. But the owner could loan the slaves also for jobs that were heavy and or dangerous, in which case he would take up an insurance. The most unfortunate were the rowers on the ships, and in that case the purchase cost of the slave was amortized quite quickly, but the conditions were such as to significantly reduce the slave's life. Even worse were the slaves, as you can imagine, employed in mines. However, once a slave had been acquired, if he or she proved reliable and of good character, the owner rarely resold him or her. In any event, in the medieval cities, the servile or slave condition did not last for the whole life. It could end, for example, with the death of the master, and it was customary for the master to set the slaves free at his death. In this case, he would leave the slaves various gift or a little severance pay, as we would call it today. It was also common to let the female slaves free when they wanted to get married, depending on how long they had worked with the owning family. However, the emancipation entailed a considerable expense for the slave, because he would earn his money by conducting independent activities on his own after having been authorized to do so by his master. Alternatively, someone else paid the emancipation fee, and the freed slave would pay back the enfranchisement money by working for the party who had advanced the enfranchisement fee. The technical term for the emancipation was manumissio, meaning letting go of the hand, and this has to do with the ceremony instituted in the Roman Empire when a slave was freed. The owner would place his hand on the shoulder of the serf and pronounce the words, "I want this man to be free." And as he did so, he would let go of the hand from the shoulder of the now freed slave. The Latin phrase was "e manu mittebat eum," from which the word manumission came in English. By the way, the term manumission papers also applied to the process of freeing slaves in the United States, for that happened there too. This miniature shows a couple bringing a slave girl in front of a judge for the ceremony of enfranchisement or emancipation, or as we said, manumission. In Europe, slavery emancipation typically occurred in two stages. In the first, the owner promised liberation, and after a few years he would confirm it. But it was not necessarily an act of generosity. The owner did not want to be burdened with the cost of maintaining the slave once he or she was no longer able to work. Not very nice, we must say. In any event, often the emancipated slaves continued to work in the same house where they had lived and worked for a lifetime. Younger women often ended up as prostitutes or concubines of the master from whom they had been emancipated. The situation wasn't much rosier for males, especially for those who had not learned the trade. They often ended up in prison for debts. This was a short journey into a corner of time, medieval European slavery, that does not usually capture the attention of mainstream history, if we can call it that way. As usual, those interested can find ample information in sundry archives and specialized publications. Thank you for watching, and until next time, I am Jim Emolia for Historical Sketches. Good night.